Black female FBI director pulled over and held at gunpoint. Officer jailed soon after. In a world where power can shift with a single revelation, the story you're about to hear will leave you speechless. Ebony Price, the first black female FBI director, accomplished, fearless and admired, finds her life twisted into a nightmarish knot on an otherwise ordinary drive. What begins as a routine journey spirals into betrayal, discrimination, and near-fatal confrontation when she's pulled over by an officer blind to her authority and her humanity. Tension builds, secrets unravel, and justice is served in a way no one could have ever anticipated. Prepare to be pulled into a vortex of power, prejudice, and karmic retribution. Ebony Price was the kind of leader who wore her authority with measured grace and quiet conviction. Raised on the outskirts of New Orleans, she had spent her early years surrounded by a kaleidoscope of cultures, languages, and challenges. Her father, William Price, had been a police officer, a proud yet overworked man who carried the badge with a sense of moral responsibility that influenced Ebony more than any lesson in a classroom ever could. Her mother, Helena, was a high school history teacher who believed education was the single greatest tool for empowerment. From the time Ebony was 6, she would stand on her tiptoes to watch her father polish his badge at the kitchen table after each long shift. He would place it in her hands, reminding her, "This star is a promise to protect. It's not just a piece of metal, it's a symbol." It was in those intimate, familial moments that Ebony decided she would follow a path of service. The FBI intrigued her even before she fully understood what the Federal Bureau of Investigation did. By high school, she was absorbing every newspaper article and documentary she could find, especially those about pioneering women in law enforcement. Although Ebony faced her share of hurdles, namely being a young black woman in predominantly white educational programs, she never let them dampen her spirit. She was determined to carve out a space in a world where few looked like her. By the time she graduated with honors in criminal justice, Ebony had already begun forging a reputation for tenacity and courage. Little did she know that her road from that small Louisiana neighborhood to the directorship of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country would be fraught with trials, and that one day she would encounter a test unlike any she had faced before. Ebony's trajectory through the FBI was anything but ordinary. After completing her rigorous training at Quantico, she started off as a special agent in the New York field office. Her early cases focused on white-collar crime, bank fraud, money laundering, and Ponzi schemes, but Ebony's true passion lay with community-based investigations. She requested to transition into units dealing with human trafficking and public corruption, areas she believed harmed society's most vulnerable. Her skill in navigating complex legal frameworks and her uncanny ability to read people earned her a string of successes. One high-profile case involved dismantling a sprawling human trafficking ring in the Tri-State area. Ebony's work saved over 24 victims, most of them minors. This operation catapulted her into the spotlight and earned her the respect of seasoned agents nationwide. As her reputation soared, so did the invitations to join specialized divisions. Leadership took notice of her unwavering integrity, and within 5 years she became an Assistant Special Agent in Charge, ASAC. During her time in Washington, D.C., she was often seen walking briskly through the halls of the J. Edgar Hoover Building, her heels echoing in quiet corridors, just as her presence echoed in the hearts of those who saw her as a role model. When the previous FBI director, Christopher Wray, announced his decision to step down, this was years in the making, and the White House was searching for a fresh face. It wasn't long before Ebony's name surfaced as a promising candidate. Critics questioned whether America was ready for a black female director. But her record spoke for itself, and the nation watched with bated breath. Through a process that tested her resolve and scrutinized every facet of her life, Ebony Price was confirmed as the first black female director in FBI history. Her father's old badge, safely kept in a small display at her home, was a reminder of how far she had come and the shoulders she stood on. Sitting at the helm of the FBI came with its own set of unique pressures. Ebony's mornings typically began at 5 a.m. with a short meditation and a workout, habits that helped center her spirit. By 7 a.m., she was combing through intelligence briefings, conferring with senior advisors on terrorism threats, cybersecurity breaches, and domestic crime waves. It was not a job for the faint of heart or the easily overwhelmed. There was pushback too. Some critics tried to undermine her authority, questioning whether her historic appointment was more about optics than merit. But Ebony never wasted time on pettiness. She had an agency to run and a national security mandate to uphold. Her father's law enforcement background kept her grounded, reminding her that even the highest office in the FBI is, at its core, an extension of community service. Away from the public eye, Ebony was also a daughter, a sister, and a mentor to numerous young professionals. She took personal interest in shaping future agents' careers, often hosting workshops on leadership, integrity, and resilience. Despite her hectic schedule, Ebony believed in direct communication, sending handwritten notes to agents who performed exceptionally well. Symbolically, she was the fortress of justice, but underneath the title and power, she carried a warm heart that resonated with those who worked closely with her. Little did she know that all the discipline, empathy, and tenacity she had cultivated over the years would soon be tested in a way that threatened not just her safety, but the very soul of the institution she led. Destiny would place her face to face with an abuse of power that would rattle the nation. It began as a simple trip, a brief departure from the daily grind of D.C. Ebony's mother had fallen ill back in Louisiana, and though doctors assured the condition was manageable, Ebony felt a profound need to see her. She cleared a weekend in her calendar and decided to make the journey alone, hoping for a few hours of solitude to gather her thoughts. Driving gave her a sense of freedom that private jets, official motorcades, and security details did not. She informed her closest staff, but insisted on going without fanfare or escort. The drive from Washington, D.C. to Louisiana was long, but Ebony welcomed the change of pace. The soft hum of tires on asphalt, the rolling landscapes, it all brought her back to her childhood trips with her parents. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a worn leather jacket. No formal suits, no polished facade. It was just Ebony, the open road, and the comfort of her own thoughts. As dusk approached on the second day of her drive, Ebony stopped at a quaint diner for dinner. She savored the small-town hospitality that reminded her of home. After paying the bill, she got back on the interstate, planning to drive another hour before checking into a motel. The moon was a silver coin in the sky, and the traffic around her was sparse, but life rarely follows script. Somewhere along that quiet stretch of highway, an event would unfold that would not only shake Ebony to her core, but ignite a firestorm of national debate, proving that discrimination can rear its ugly head anywhere, at any time, and spare no one. 10 miles past an exit sign that announced Millerton, 15 miles, Ebony noticed blue and red lights illuminating her rearview mirror. She glanced down at her speedometer. She was traveling just under the speed limit. Confusion flickered in her mind. Why was she being pulled over? She carefully signaled and pulled to the shoulder, her heartbeat quickening. It wasn't fear. She had been pulled over before for minor traffic checks, but this felt off. There was hardly any traffic, and she had done nothing to violate any rules. Taking a calming breath, she reminded herself that she was not just any citizen, she was the director of the FBI. This was simply a misunderstanding. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, displaying the route. She considered calling her staff or the local FBI field office, but decided to handle it the standard way. Reaching into her glove compartment, she pulled out her driver's license and vehicle registration. As an extra precaution, she also slipped her official FBI badge in her back pocket, just in case. The officer approached, shining a flashlight into her side mirror. Ebony's heart pounded as she rolled down the window. She was used to tough interrogations and tense negotiations, but there was something about the unpredictability of a nighttime traffic stop that made her uneasy. She forced herself to remain calm, to rely on her training. "License and registration," the officer said curtly, not bothering with any greeting. His tone was cold. Ebony carefully handed over the documents, speaking in a measured voice. "Officer, is there a problem? I believe I was within the speed limit." He gave no immediate answer, stepping away to his cruiser. Ebony waited, pulse thrumming. Moments later he returned, face clouded with suspicion. "Out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. Confusion and anxiety spiraled within her. "May I ask why?" she asked politely, her voice unwavering. "Step out of the vehicle now," he shouted, placing his hand on his holster. And in that instant, Ebony felt a chill descend, knowing this was no ordinary stop, and that the situation was careening toward danger. Ebony slowly opened the door, her hands raised above her shoulders. She had faced terrorists, career criminals, and hardened gangs. Yet something about this moment filled her with a dread she'd rarely experienced. The officer's posture was rigid, hostility etched into his features. His partner, a younger officer, stood by the cruiser, radio in hand, looking nervous. The senior officer barked, "Hands on the hood, now!" Ebony complied, trying to catch the junior officer's eye, hoping for some sign of reason. Instead, the younger officer looked away, lips pressed tight in discomfort or fear. Ebony suspected this stop had nothing to do with traffic violations. She tried explaining, "Sir, I'm Director Ebony Price of the FBI. My identification is in my back pocket." Her calm tone belied the storm roaring within her. Typically, the mention of her name or the FBI badge would trigger a moment of clarity, an immediate shift in an officer's demeanor. But not tonight. "Shut up," the senior officer snapped, drawing his weapon. "I don't want to hear any of your nonsense. I know your type." His voice dripped with a contempt Ebony recognized all too well, raw prejudice, the kind that refused to see reason. Ebony's breath caught. Any sudden move could be misconstrued as a threat. She had trained hundreds of agents on how to de-escalate tense situations, yet now she found herself powerless. A part of her mind, trained in crisis management, scanned for possible outcomes: compliance, negotiation, or an attempt to display her official credentials. But the man behind her had already drawn his gun, and logic told her this was about power, not public safety. Every second stretched into an eternity. Ebony could feel the cold metal of the car's hood beneath her palms. The officer stepped closer, pressing the muzzle of his firearm near her shoulder. The world had narrowed to this hostile confrontation. She took a slow, trembling breath, praying that cooler heads would prevail before an irrevocable tragedy occurred. In the paralyzing silence, Ebony steadied herself. "Officer," she said evenly, "I am armed, but it's an FBI-issued firearm. I'm placing my right hand behind my back to retrieve my credentials. No sudden moves." She felt the muzzle push harder, eliciting a wince. "Did I say you could move?" He spat. His nameplate read W. Randall, though Ebony doubted he cared whether she saw it or not. It was the junior officer who intervened first. "So maybe we should check the ID. She might—" Randall turned abruptly, aiming his venom at his partner. "Don't you ever question me in front of a suspect, Officer Davis. You learn to trust your gut, and my gut says she's lying." Ebony exhaled, each breath feeling like a gamble. She recognized the legal dangers of this situation, an officer ignoring her credentials, refusing to verify her identity, and brandishing a firearm without cause. If she were anyone else, without rank, without the possibility of calls that could mobilize entire units, would she even be alive after such hostility? The tension cracked when headlights flooded the scene. Another patrol car pulled up, and out stepped a local sheriff's deputy. Ebony glimpsed the department's insignia, a star with Millerton County etched around it. He approached cautiously, one hand on his radio. "What's going on here?" the deputy asked, surveying Ebony's pinned posture. Randall barely turned his head. She's resisting, possibly armed. I've got it under control. The deputy looked skeptical. Ma'am, may I see some ID? Ebony carefully slid her left hand toward her back pocket, pulling out the small leather case that bore the golden FBI shield. She handed it to the sheriff's deputy, who flipped it open, shining his flashlight on the badge and Ebony's photo. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, quickly replaced by alarm. "Officer Randall!" he hissed. "You'd better step back." The moment crystallized. Something was about to give, and Ebony prayed the last shards of reason would keep her alive. Randall, however, refused to yield. He was locked in a moment of pure rage, fueled by whatever prejudices had grown inside him over the years. "I don't care who she says she is," he snarled, pressing the muzzle against Ebony's shoulder. "For all I know, this could be a fake ID. You can buy these online these days." Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably, looking between his partner and the sheriff's deputy. The tension was thick, as if every molecule of air crackled with potential violence. The deputy spoke carefully. "That's not just any ID. This is Ebony Price, the FBI director." Randall's eyes flickered with disbelief. "What?" For a moment, Ebony felt the pressure lessen. But then his anger flared anew, perhaps out of fear, shame, or sheer obstinacy. "She doesn't get special treatment for being some big shot. She's just another suspect to me." The sheriff's deputy took a step forward. "Officer Randall, put your weapon down. This is an order." Silence hung. Then a flicker of movement. Randall's gun hand trembled, and Ebony braced for the worst. Yet in that split second, Ebony heard an approaching siren. Another cruiser, likely responding to the deputy's backup call. A seasoned state trooper emerged, with stripes on his uniform indicating a higher rank. One glance at Ebony's badge in the deputy's hand and at Randall's drawn weapon told him enough. He barked, "Officer, stand down. This woman is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Randall wavered, the realization that he had pointed a gun at the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country slowly sinking in. His face contorted between confusion and the grim understanding of what he had done. He lowered his weapon, but the damage was already done. Ebony Price, the FBI director, stood there in the darkness, trembling from the near-catastrophic misuse of force. Within the hour, Ebony found herself seated in a small police station in Millerton County, the sheriff's office. Officers hovered nervously, offering coffee, water, and apologies. She accepted a glass of water with unsteady hands, still rattled by the confrontation. The sheriff, a middle-aged man named Robert Devereaux, was bending over backward to correct the wrongs inflicted by Randall's actions. "Madam Director, I'm so sorry. This never should have happened. We're placing Randall on immediate administrative leave, pending an investigation," Devereaux explained, sweat beading on his forehead. Ebony rubbed her temples, pushing back the image of a gun barrel near her shoulder. "Sheriff Devereaux, I appreciate your efforts, but administrative leave won't cut it." He pointed a gun at me without provocation, ignoring repeated attempts to identify myself. What if I were someone with less authority, less protection? Would that individual walk away unscathed? Her question was rhetorical, but it hit like a sledgehammer. Devereaux looked down, nodding grimly. "I'll cooperate fully with any federal investigation," he assured her. The junior officer, Davis, was in another room, giving his statement. From what Ebony overheard, Davis was shaken, but complicit in not intervening sooner. Ebony couldn't help but imagine how many other times Randall had overstepped his bounds, using intimidation and prejudice in the line of duty. When Ebony finally stepped outside, the sky was on the verge of dawn, stained with soft hues of pink and orange. Despite her exhaustion, a spark of determination ignited within her. This wasn't just about her personal ordeal. It was about systemic issues, about accountability, about ensuring that no one, regardless of rank or race, should face such blatant misuse of power. She resolved, then and there, that this incident would not be swept under the rug. If she had to shake the foundations of law enforcement protocols across the country, she would. After all, she was the FBI director, and she had the power to make sure it never happened again. Word of the incident traveled at breakneck speed. By the time Ebony got back on the road, her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and text messages. When she finally arrived at her mother's home in Louisiana, media vans were already parked outside. She detoured to a nearby hotel, hoping to avoid a scene that would stress her convalescing mother. In Washington, D.C., the FBI's public relations team scrambled to control the narrative. They prepared statements and developed talking points for a press conference. Political leaders, civil rights organizations, and law enforcement agencies demanded an explanation. The president himself phoned Ebony, expressing shock and support, assuring her that the Department of Justice would back any inquiry she deemed necessary. Meanwhile, Ebony navigated personal turmoil. She needed to be by her mother's side, yet she also needed to handle the firestorm brewing in the capital. She spent that evening making arrangements for her mother's care, ensuring local doctors and neighbors could offer support. Her mother, Helena, insisted Ebony do whatever was needed. She could see the resolve burning in her daughter's eyes, the same resolve that once drove her to become an FBI agent despite the odds. Reporters stood outside the hotel lobby, eager for a statement. Ebony gave them a measured response, confirming that an investigation was underway, but withholding details. Her words, calm, authoritative, sent a message that this wouldn't be a footnote. It would be a turning point. Late that night, Ebony sank into her hotel bed, replaying the moment Randall's gun pressed against her shoulder. The fear, the rage, the sense of violation. But beneath the emotional upheaval was a steely certainty. Wrongdoing had been done in the name of law enforcement, and it must be confronted. So much for a quiet trip to see her mother. Destiny had other plans. Back in Washington, a special team of FBI agents was mobilized under the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Usually, Ebony would be at the forefront of orchestrating such an operation, but this time she was the victim. Protocol demanded she distance herself from the direct management of the investigation to avoid conflicts of interest. Yet she was still updated regularly by her deputy director, a seasoned agent named Kelsey Hughes, who had a reputation for dogged tenacity. Hughes and her team quickly uncovered disturbing details about Officer William Randall's record. Complaints of excessive force, verbal abuse, and racially biased misconduct peppered his personnel file. Most complaints had been dismissed or quietly settled. No major disciplinary actions had stuck, perhaps thanks to a flawed system or local politics. The question hung in the air: how many unwarranted stops had this man carried out? How many times had people of color felt his wrath? Press conferences multiplied, with Ebony giving carefully worded statements. "I trust the investigative process to handle this incident with full transparency and rigor. We must ensure law enforcement officers adhere to the standards they've sworn to uphold." Civil rights groups lauded her stance, while certain corners of law enforcement bristled at what they perceived as a crackdown. Meanwhile, Ebony wrestled with her own emotional landscape. Trauma from the incident lingered. Nights were restless, haunted by the echo of Randall's shouts. She'd endured close calls in her FBI career, but there was a different kind of sting to this, being threatened by one sworn to protect. As the public watched, one central question demanded an answer. Would the system hold Officer Randall accountable, or would he become another statistic in the long line of officers who evade consequences? Ebony vowed that, come what may, she would see this through to the end. The following weeks were a minefield of legal complexities and political wrangling. Officer Randall hired a high-profile defense attorney known for defending law enforcement personnel accused of misconduct. The attorney's public statements framed the event as a miscommunication and alleged Ebony had brandished her credentials in a threatening manner. Ebony's camp fired back with body camera footage, short but damning. Randall's gun was drawn, Ebony calmly explaining her position. There was no evidence of her resisting or acting aggressively. Meanwhile, Ebony found herself in a precarious position at the FBI. Some high-ranking officials advised her to let the Justice Department run the show, to maintain a neutral stance. But Ebony saw this as part of her duty. She could not ignore her own near-death confrontation at the hands of a local police officer. The national conversation about police reform and accountability couldn't be sidestepped. She refused to become a silent figurehead, and that resolve put her at odds with certain political factions. Protests erupted outside Milton's police station and in major cities. Grassroots movements saw in Ebony a powerful symbol, an embodiment of what black women endure even at the highest echelons of society. "If it can happen to the FBI director, it can happen to any of us," became a rallying cry. In the midst of the public spectacle, Ebony continued to juggle her personal responsibilities. She frequently checked on her mother, whose health seemed to improve, each day giving Ebony the strength and emotional bandwidth to persevere. Late at night, Ebony stared at the old badge of her father, her compass for moral clarity. She remembered his words, "The badge is a promise." Now, more than ever, that promise needed to be kept, not just by her, but by everyone who wore a uniform. As the formal investigation deepened, Agent Kelsey Hughes' team started to piece together a troubling mosaic of Officer Randall's behavior. Interviews with residents revealed years of intimidation tactics, especially in predominantly black neighborhoods. "He used to trail me when I walked home," said one young man who refused to give his name out of fear of retaliation. Others told stories of vehicle stops for the flimsiest of reasons, broken taillights that weren't actually broken, matching a suspect's description, or simply driving through the wrong part of town. Then came a bombshell. The team discovered internal memos indicating a pattern of covering up Randall's misdeeds within the Milton County Police Department. Higher-ups had repeatedly lost or misfiled complaints. Over time, Randall's record remained officially clean. This was systemic rot, deeply ingrained. Additionally, bits of personal data emerged that spoke to his state of mind. Social media posts, made under a pseudonym, revealed troubling views about race and law enforcement. The posts weren't overt enough to trigger immediate suspicion, but they painted a picture of someone who saw certain communities as perpetual threats. When Agent Hughes confronted local authorities with this new evidence, they scrambled to distance themselves from Randall. Some gave statements condemning him, while others resigned, fueling rumors that more individuals in the department might have been complicit. The local community grew increasingly vocal, staging sit-ins and marches demanding not just Randall's prosecution, but a top-to-bottom audit of the police force. All this information filtered back to Ebony, each new revelation eliciting both outrage and a reaffirmation of her mission. She felt like she was standing on the precipice of a systemic overhaul. Her near tragedy could be the spark igniting major reforms, or it could become another cautionary tale if the system failed to act decisively. That was a risk she wouldn't allow. 4 months after the traffic stop, the case finally landed in federal court. Officer William Randall faced charges of violating Ebony Price's civil rights under color of law, a serious offense carrying significant penalties. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle. Media outlets camped outside the courthouse, while political commentators debated everything from racial profiling to the moral fabric of policing. Ebony arrived with her legal team, dressed in a tailored black suit that exuded professionalism and resolve. She was determined to face Randall, not as the FBI director flaunting her title, but as a citizen wronged by a misuse of power. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge, a stern woman known for no-nonsense rulings, presided with calm authority. The prosecution laid out the facts succinctly. Ebony was pulled over without lawful cause, forcibly detained, and held at gunpoint, despite repeatedly identifying herself. Body camera footage, though partially obscured, corroborated Ebony's account. The evidence included the newly uncovered internal memos and testimonies from other citizens who had lodged complaints against Randall over the years. Randall's defense attempted a two-pronged strategy. First, to argue that Ebony's behavior seemed suspicious and that Randall had acted out of an abundance of caution. And second, to claim that Ebony's position as FBI director had influenced the investigation, tipping the scales against Randall. But the jury saw through the smokescreen. Multiple witnesses, including the sheriff's deputy who verified Ebony's credentials on scene, testified that Ebony had been nothing but cooperative. Ebony herself took the stand on the third day of testimony. She recounted every detail, voice steady but imbued with an undercurrent of emotional truth. "I stand here not just for myself," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I stand here for every person who has been victimized by those entrusted to protect them. My position shouldn't matter, but if this can happen to me, imagine what happens to those without my resources or visibility." Her words struck a chord. Spectators in the courtroom quietly dabbed tears or nodded in agreement. Even some in law enforcement quietly acknowledged the magnitude of the wrong. After nearly 2 weeks, the jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on multiple counts, including the most serious charge of violating Ebony's constitutional rights under the color of law. The room erupted in hushed relief. Randall sat silent, staring at the wooden defense table as though it might offer an escape. There would be no easy way out. A sentencing hearing was scheduled for a month later. When sentencing day arrived, people from across the country tuned in, waiting to see whether the justice system would deliver accountability. Ebony had chosen not to make another victim impact statement, believing her trial testimony spoke volumes. Instead, she sat in the front row alongside her deputy director, Kelsey Hughes, and a handful of supporters from the FBI. The judge outlined the severity of Randall's actions, citing his abuse of authority and blatant disregard for Ebony's constitutional rights. Then came the announcement. Randall was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, along with mandated community service upon release and mandatory bias counseling. The courtroom was silent, except for the echoes of the gavel. Randall's attorney placed a consoling hand on his client's shoulder, but the officer barely reacted, as if in a daze. Word of the sentencing spread quickly. Civil rights advocates hailed it as a landmark case, a sign that even law enforcement officers who went too far could be held to account. Skeptics pointed out that while 10 years might sound substantial, the real impact would depend on broader reforms. Ebony agreed. One conviction was not enough to heal systemic wounds, but it was a start. Behind the scenes, the fallout in Millerton County had already reshaped the local police department. The chief resigned amidst pressure, and a thorough review by the Department of Justice was underway, examining hiring practices, complaint procedures, and accountability measures. Citizen review boards were being formed, an idea Ebony wholeheartedly supported. For Ebony personally, the moment offered a bittersweet victory. She was relieved by the outcome, but the sting of her own traumatic experience lingered. She visited her mother the following weekend, finding solace in Helena's slowly improving health. Sitting on the old porch swing, she confided, "Mama, I never wanted a crusade like this, but if it prevents even one innocent life from harm, it's worth it." Her mother's eyes sparkled with pride. "Child, sometimes we don't choose the battles, they choose us, and you stood up for what's right." Looking out at the tall oak trees swaying in the breeze, Ebony felt a sense of calm. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. She intended to carry those lessons back to her office at the J. Edgar Hoover building, ensuring that the promise of the badge, her father's badge, remained unbroken. Ebony returned to Washington, D.C., to a hero's welcome from many within the FBI. Agents lined the halls in quiet solidarity, not out of forced ceremony, but genuine respect for a leader who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. Deputy Director Hughes gave her a quick embrace and whispered, "Welcome home." In the days that followed, Ebony rolled out a new initiative called Operation Guardian, focusing on enhanced training for local law enforcement agencies. It emphasized de-escalation tactics, cultural sensitivity, and federal oversight mechanisms designed to hold departments accountable when complaints surfaced. Ebony also coordinated with national law enforcement leaders to push for standardized reporting systems that would prevent problematic officers from simply moving to other jurisdictions undetected. Critics claimed Ebony was capitalizing on her personal experience to exert federal authority over local forces, but Ebony refused to be deterred. She had seen firsthand what unchecked power could lead to. "Trust is a two-way street," she said at a press conference. "Communities must trust officers, and officers must be worthy of that trust." 1 month after Randall's sentencing, Ebony drove to a memorial park on the outskirts of the city. Dressed in civilian clothes, she walked to a small monument dedicated to fallen law enforcement officers. A faint breeze rustled the trees overhead. Ebony placed a single white rose at the base, thinking of her father, William Price, and the ideals of service that once glimmered in his freshly polished badge. "We have work to do," she murmured, as though speaking to him across time. A sense of closure filled her heart, tinged with the knowledge that her path was not yet complete. This ordeal had been a crucible, forging within her a sharpened sense of justice. She was still Ebony Price, the first black female director of the FBI, but she was also a survivor, an advocate, and a living testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. As she walked away from the memorial, her silhouette against the setting sun seemed a testament to resilience itself. Tomorrow there would be new battles to fight, new initiatives to launch, new communities to protect. But for now, Ebony embraced a moment of peace. She had stared down the barrel of a gun held by one sworn to protect the public, and she prevailed, not just for herself, but for countless others who deserved a nation free from prejudice cloaked as law. Justice, resilience, transformation. In the end, Ebony Price's journey underscores the notion that a single event, however jarring, can serve as a catalyst for sweeping change. She refused to be defined by fear or anger. Instead, she harnessed the truth to illuminate dark corners of the system. By standing firm, she reminded us all that authority, when misused, must face the scales of justice. If this story resonates with you, if it stirs something deeper within your own vision of a fair and accountable society, please support our channel. Like this video, share it with friends or on social media, and most importantly, subscribe to stay updated on more compelling stories and discussions. Your engagement helps spread awareness and encourages us to continue shedding light on the narratives that matter most. Thank you for joining us on this journey. The pursuit of justice remains a collective effort.